Hello, I'm Hannah, and this is Hannah's Books. Welcome to another day of this multi-day celebration of Willa Cather's life and novels. Today I am joined by the fabulous Ros of the channel Scallydandling About the Books to talk about Cather's The Professor's House. This was my first reading of this particular novel, and I loved it. There is so much to think about, and it was especially wonderful to get to hear Roz's ideas and interpretations. This discussion has no spoilers, not that the book really does either, but we didn't even mention some of the less anticipated plot points that might happen later in the book. All right, let's get on to the discussion. Hello, Roz. How are you? It's good to see you.
Lovely to see you, Hannah, and I'm fine and dandy.
I'm so glad you're here to talk about this book. And tell
Mm.
me a little bit to start off with about your history with Cather. You haven't read this book, right? Before?
No, my history with Cather is uh, very, very limited, I would say. She's a writer that almost passed me by completely. Um, and then a few years ago, I read My Antonia, um, because I think it probably came up in one of those lists of, you know, great books you should have read, or great books you might not have heard, or and read it and loved it, and kind of meant to go back to her but somehow haven't. But yeah, and so that was why when you mentioned it, I was like, yes, I'm up for this.
Well, My Antonia has been one of my favorites for a long time, and I've read it a couple of times, but I haven't read a whole lot of Cather. So this book
No.
was new for me, in fact.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and this was a really good choice for me. I
Good.
think it hit the right spot for me. So
Me too. Me too. I loved it. So the book is The Professor's House, and it's a singular noun, but it's of course about we have very different covers. Oh,
different
that's
covers.
lovely.
Yeah. Yeah, mine's an old Virago modern classic. I love that in print.
And mine's an old vintage classics.
Yeah.
So it's a singular title, but it's actually a book about more than one house. But can you
Yes.
start off by telling us just a little bit about what's going on at the beginning, of how about the house that the professor is living in, and
Absolutely. Well, one of the things I loved about this book is it's got one of the great openings of yeah, one of the best openings I've read in any book this year, I think, because it begins with the professor. We meet him kind of walking around his empty house that he's moving out of. And if you've ever had that experience of moving house, a house that you've lived in for quite a long time, and maybe either the house you grew up in or a house that you brought your children up in, or whatever, it's a very
Grace.
specific and significant experience, and so that's how the book starts, and we have that sort of all those feelings of nostalgia and looking back and remembering things, and then the point is he doesn't actually manage to leave the house. He can't let go of his old house. So although he has a new house and his wife moves into the new house and he in theory moves into the new house, he hangs on to the old house as well because that's the only place he feels he can work. Well, that's his excuse. But he needs to
And I
complete
think
his.
it is at least partly an excuse. I mean, he
Hmm,
feels so connected. He feels like that's
yeah,
where life brings him meaning.
yeah, yeah.
And
Um,
I
yeah.
think you're
So
right that there are all the memories there, but given that some of those memories are memories with his wife and his wife isn't there, can you talk a little bit about his relationship with his wife at this point? It's
well, I,
complicated.
I again, you get straight to the nub of things, Hannah, because you're so good at that. But because I'd say another of the things that I really found fascinating about this book, really enjoyed this book, is in this book is the way it's a portrait of a marriage, but a portrait of being a middle aged person. in a marriage. And one of the things that's sort of very clear in the book is that he and his wife were very much in love when they got together. They were young and passionately in love, and that this book, one of the themes is about how it's almost like falling out of love, or although still being affectionate and concerned about your partner, but falling out of love, which I found really interesting. I think you and I are both people who didn't fall out of love in our marriages, and but it was as it would it really succeeded as a portrait of that. I'm uh, he a few times talks with regret about the fact that he no longer feels about her the way that he did and the way she's changed. And they do kind of have moments of quite honest discussion of that, and like she says to him, it's not because of the children, it's not that. And he sort of accuses her of, I don't know, being more interested in things now than you know the things they used to care about. She's interested in objects, furniture. You say she's interested in
The
furniture
new
and
house.
and the new house and her children's, their daughters' houses and so on. And she says to him, but you have to go on living. Is what she says, which is so true and so fair. And he's put so much of himself into his great work, his book about the Spanish explorers, which no doubt we'll come back to, that it's as if he's allowed, although he loved his daughters and he loved having a family, and we hear about his joy and all that, in a sense, it's like they were the backdrop to
Right,
his life.
right. Yeah.
Did
I,
you
I think
yeah. Oh, well, I was
I
going to say, did you pick up on the bit about the Bayeux tapestry?
no.
Oh, so
Remind
there's
me.
so there's this bit where he talks about how Queen Matilda and the others, her women that sewed the Bayeux tapestry, that they put the great events in it, but they also put like kind of birds and flowers and so on in the borders,
That's
and
right.
how the life of his family was like the birds and flowers
The
in the in the,
flowers.
in the background, and it wasn't the center of his life, which is a very selfish thing, really, isn't it?
There are a remarkable number of moments in this book where I think he's really quite selfish, and that he thinks of himself as so above the materialism that he accuses his wife of and his
Yeah.
daughter of.
Mm.
And yet there are times where he's, very interested in things himself.
Oh,
Um,
yeah.
can you figure out any way to how to how does he do that? How does he rationalize his own
Well,
pleasure in
yeah, I
things?
mean, I think, um, well, I have two thoughts about that. One is that people aren't rational, so it's like what he purports to believe and what he actually, like there's a really interesting section where he has a big moan about how rubbish science is and how it's sort of ruining the human race and making us all materialistic and not think, we've lost the joy of, the things that religion has done for human, I don't know, sense of awe and wonder and their place in the world. But he's not religious himself. He doesn't actually believe that. And at other times, he's really quite enthusiastic about the, science and
Mhm.
experiment and innovation and so on. So he's just, he's a human being who's contradictory, which
Yes,
is
yes.
rich and lovely, isn't it? Yeah.
Well, there's actually a remarkable amount about commerce in this book. That between, buying the new houses and furnishing the new houses, both his own house, but also his helping his daughter
Yeah.
furnish hers. Um,
well, because the other thing I was thinking about, that sort of dichotomy, being pulled in two directions that you see in his character. Like, I wondered, and you know a lot more about her than I do, but and one shouldn't always attribute everything in books to the author's, life or experience or values. But it felt like maybe she's with someone who was pulled in two directions, in a
That's really
similar way.
fascinating. But I
Yeah.
found out, I didn't think about this when I was reading the book of the timing
Mm.
here, but I realized later on, or read somewhere later on, that right as she was writing this book, she bought a house for the first time, or she bought land for the first time.
Yeah.
She'd rented before, and she and her partner, her long-term partner Edith, built a house looking at the water. So clearly, she was
Mm.
thinking about buying.
Yeah.
It's a simple house, supposedly.
Yeah. And she, the flavor you get from her books is that she likes to look back to older times, and that might have been better times, and that maybe, sort of disapproving of elements of modern life and consumerism and so on, and expresses that through the professor, but yes, on the other hand, like, she lived in New York for decades, didn't she? She's not. Yeah. So it's not straightforward.
And I think, a lot of times when the professor says he doesn't want to go out and buy things and stuff his house with things, he's thinking about the purchases. And somehow when people give him gifts, whether it's turquoises and pottery or fancy hotel stays, that's all generosity and connection. And he's somehow, I mean, he doesn't seem to recognize that
Yeah.
profiting from, somebody else's paying for it doesn't seem to
Yeah.
matter.
Doesn't he? Suddenly he doesn't mind. Yeah, but he won't buy himself a new stove
Right.
for his study where he works. Yeah.
Well, we were talking, you were talking about how he falls out of love with
Hmm.
his partner and with his wife. And in some ways, it seems that he replaces his wife to a degree, not in passion, but in a sense of connection, with the young student, Tom, that is
Yeah.
this intellectual. She had been his intellectual peer before, and it sort of shifts to Tom. Does that ring true to you? Do you?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think, and it's quite explicit that she kind of becomes jealous of his relationship with Tom. And I think as a modern reader, you think, well, what was his relationship with Tom?
Right.
Was it just a sort of professor? It's almost like he's like an adopted son, and becomes a son-in-law. But it feels like there's something, there's a love
It does.
element
Yeah.
to. He's very attracted to
Right.
Tom, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that too. We don't get any hint in the book that it's a sexual relationship
Oh,
at all,
no, no,
but
not
it's
at all.
clearly an emotionally more resonant relationship than we would
Yeah,
assume would happen between a teacher and a student. It was not
yeah,
as simple as
yeah,
that.
yeah.
And Tom changes his life in all sorts of ways,
Yes.
including having the money to do some of the things that happen in this book.
Mm.
But it's because of Tom's um, uh, invention or technological
Yeah,
advances that allowed
yeah.
for invention.
Yes, it's always a bit vague about what this gas is and how it works. So we don't have to worry about it,
Right.
do we? But that's where the 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 patent for that is where the money comes from. Yeah, yeah.
Right.
That goes to
So,
his sister. Yeah,
so
yeah.
uh, I find it interesting that Cather so frequently uses um, male points of view, perspectives. And in this case, we have two. There's a second section, very much written in
Mm.
Tom's voice. Um, do you have any thoughts on why authors might choose to do that, to choose protagonists and narrators sometimes that are.
I know it in a way it seems surprising, and yet I suppose it, I mean like if you want to say certain things, it may be easier to do them through a male character, you know, because of the options that that male character has. You know what I mean? She didn't want to write oh, I've forgotten the wife's name. Lillian, that's it. She doesn't want to write Lillian's story, does she? She's
Right,
not interested in Lillian's story.
right.
She's interested in St. Peter's story. So you know, and I might have been interested in Lillian's story, but she isn't. I suppose it's about. I mean, she could have written about a female academic, a female writer. She's a female writer herself, you know. She female, but yes, it feels. I don't know. Why do you think? Why do you think she does it?
I don't know. I think in Cather's case specifically, it may be partly because of her sexuality, that there definitely are biographers, at least, who have speculated that it's her effort to be able to look at women and talk about women with desire
Right.
without um, having to be blunt about
Yeah.
it.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
But
That she
in this book, I think
purposely.
that doesn't make sense because
No.
he's not looking at women with desire.
No. No.
Uh,
Not at all. Not at all. Yeah. Yeah. So yes, it's a bit of a mystery. I mean, I wonder whether that's one of the reasons why this is. I gather this is slightly seen as possibly a problem book of hers. Well, I mean, I didn't think of it like that at all as I was reading it, but I gather some over the decades, you know, over the century since it was published, there've been times when people have seen it in a less positive light than some of her other books, mysteriously to me. Like people didn't like the structure, but I loved the structure.
so
We
let's talk
haven't talked.
about the structure.
Yeah,
We've
let's
got
talk about the
this section
structure.
about the house. Actually, to have a book about with interesting structure be about structures is also
Hmm,
kind of interesting. But there,
very.
so we've got the house scene, and then we totally shift gears to a totally new setting and a totally new voice.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, yes.
telling us,
We've had this whole sort of something that's a bit like a family saga, I suppose, or almost with not a lot of plot, but a lot of incident, you know. And then we're transported from Michigan. It is Michigan,
yeah,
isn't it? Yeah, yeah. To down to the southwest to ranches and railroads and mesas and you know, cattle and you know, and yes, a very different atmosphere, a very different environment, and suddenly we're in this sort of buddy story
yeah,
of
yeah, a different buddy story.
yeah, different buddy story. Possibly an even one that it feels even sort of more of a queer relationship,
Yes,
although again not sexual, as
right.
you know. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and it's this relationship between Tom
Mm,
and Roddy, one of his friends,
yeah,
who, over the course of this section, actually have a falling out. And
yeah.
the end of their friendship feels very weighted too. It feels, I think it adds to that sense that this was more than what we might expect in a buddy movie.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, Roddy's kind of. I mean, it's quite tragic what happens, you know, or the way like Roddy wants to do something good for Tom and does something that Tom on the contrary is very angry and upset about, and Tom really lets him know. And when Roddy sort of leaves, he sort of I can't think quite how he puts it, but he wants to say, "Oh, I'm glad this is me doing you doing this to me, not me doing this to you."
It's a
You know,
heartbreaking moment.
which is absolutely, yes, really tender, tragic moment. Yeah, Yeah.
So let's just very briefly summarize what happens.
Mm.
They are walking around the Southwest, and as they're hiking around, they find what is, I'll leave a picture actually of some of the similar ruins in the video.
Mhm.
What they find is essentially a house built into the walls of the rock. And they decide to excavate it with hopes to make money by selling what they find, partly.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah. Or but Tom kind of is thinking museums and so on, and
right,
but
right,
Roddy didn't understand that.
right. Yes,
It's
Tom wants to sell it to the Smithsonian, the
yeah.
big federal government's museum,
Mm.
and Roddy sells it to the highest bidder instead.
Who's going to take it abroad, and now. And there's some very, very beautiful description of the town in the or village in the cliffs, in the caves, and so on, and some beautiful moments there. Now, what it made me uh, question, and this is a bit of a question for you because you've read more by her than I have, but I felt like when we're in the Midwest, it's as if it was empty country kind of, and European migrants. You have that feeling. There's no sense that there might have been people living there before who'd been displaced. Whereas down in the southwest, it's like all real. She's writing with apparent sort of respect and enthusiasm about the sort of the culture of the sort of Pueblo or whatever people that were there, and as a sort of this wonderful bit of kind of American heritage that must be protected. I found that really interesting, and I wondered if you'd sort of had any
Absolutely.
better
I find
sense of
it
that than me.
fascinating, but I also think she does, it's an area where there's still multiple native populations that are living right there. And she doesn't mention living people. And that's an absence that's kind of shocking.
Oh,
Nevertheless, the way she talks about the ancestral Papuans is so respectful. On the other hand, it becomes the story of commerce again.
hmm.
That not only does Roddy sell, but Tom seems to think they have a right to excavate all of this, which is kind of amazing for a
Oh,
non-scientist, but also, that this is an area that people are still connected to. And then
oh,
he takes, even with the very best intentions and very beautiful language about how this belongs to, all people in America, he
oh,
takes it to the federal government and the and says this belongs to all of us who don't have ancestors. And it's like, well,
well, what about
that's,
that?
yeah, and I find that just a fascinating, I mean, it's not necessarily what Cather believes. We don't know. It's what Tom is believing
Yeah.
and what Roddy does. And
Yeah,
uh,
but the way she portrays it, I mean, because it there's a kind of the town in the cliff is described almost like a kind of a Xanadu, magical, it's lovely to read, very sort of romantic. And she has the Belgian priests sort of say, oh well, probably they were all killed off by some roving tribe of Indians that didn't appreciate the culture, So it's like, oh well, they were good because they were in this, they built the town, and then there was these other savages, So it's, I don't know, it's hard to just take that as not uh, indicating a bit of, I don't know, some mix in her head between valuing one set of indigenous culture and dismissing another. I don't know.
I think it's also really fascinating that she um makes Tom read Virgil's Aeneid.
Yeah.
through all of this. And so he's, first of all, it's the start of building a new nation, but it's
Mm.
also this link of making this a classical culture in a lot of ways. And
Yes.
I think when they're talking about the pottery, he said, "Oh, it's just like, is it Crete? The
Yes.
art on the pots, or just like some classical." Um,
Known where or something. Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, yeah, yeah. So
fascinating.
it's very interesting, and it does kind of date it, I guess, to her the time she was writing, and like I always try very hard not to sort of apply anachronistic kind of understanding to someone writing a century ago, but it was
Right,
still
right.
intriguing. One of the things that I know people kind of debate about her is to what extent she was a modernist writer.
Yes.
And I know that the one of the sort of arguments put forward for this being more of a modernist book is the structure, because you've got sort of the wraparound bits of story before and after, and then this very different bit in the middle. So it's a sort of it's a non-linear structure, uh, and yeah, dramatic change in style and voice and environment and so on. I don't know, but I don't know if we should just talk a little about, yeah,
Let's
modernist
definitely
or not.
do. Yes. Yeah, and she's well known for starting the phrase "the world splitting apart in 1922" or
Mm,
thereabouts, or something like that.
yeah,
And she, in general, she identified herself as part of the rear guard, not a modernist. And yet, clearly, we have the structural play, and we haven't talked about it, but in the latter part of the book, the idea of um, life feeling meaningless or
yeah,
unmoored is such a theme.
yes, yeah,
And we even have the death of a character in the war. So, lots of the things that, Virginia Woolf might talk about in
yes,
her house
absolutely.
book,
Yeah,
refer
and
here.
although she absolutely doesn't use sort of like stream of consciousness and so on, she is very interested in the inner consciousness of her main character, isn't she? In a way that you wouldn't see in a perhaps in a Victorian uh, similar Victorian. That's very um uh it felt modern to me
Mhm.
in that sense, and uh you were talking about the pots and so on, and we've talked about the empty house and the thing about it. There is a lot of symbolism in the book, isn't there? You can't avoid seeing it again and again. The one of the most obvious, and that made me smile, and I'm sure did you, was in his study that he keeps in the old house and he can't leave. Um, the one other person who used that room was the seamstress who would come every year and make new clothes for the family, and she has they're called forms, the
Yeah,
sort of,
dress forms. Yeah.
yeah, for making that you pin dress, when you're making dresses, and he ends up sort of like he won't let her take them away, so they're his companions. So his wife and daughters leave this house, but he keeps the pretend versions of them.
That's exactly what it is. Yeah, it makes them feel at home, I think. Yes.
uh,
Yes.
uh, but there's a quite a lot of that sort of thing in the book, not always quite so explicit, I guess. So yeah, which again feels modernist, I
Yeah,
think. To
it does. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I know you've been reading another modernist author who was traditional in certain ways too this year, and that's Ian Forster. Did you do you see any parallels with his work
Mhm.
in this book?
Yeah, yes, I do. I mean, one parallel is that fascination with relationships, and I, I mean, I think Forster is known for being very humanist in his philosophy, and but he's very interested in uh, discomfort in relationships, which is very much paralleled here, isn't it? Um, and but the other thing that he does, like, yeah, that again I would see as a similarity is he doesn't feel the need to I'm trying to find the right word to put it in words. Like, she writes very kind of clear, positively pellucid sentences, doesn't she? They're very unfussy and pared down. And although Forster styles that a little bit more florid, but it's a similar thing of like, yeah, you don't get the Joyce Wolf,
Right, right.
it is that sort of like
Clear.
very polished and clear.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Well, I
I
was even thinking about a couple of his specific books. I mean,
Yeah.
Miss Howard's End, kind of this house book,
Yep.
and Passage to India, the wild world of another
Mm.
culture. I'm curious. I don't know if she read
I want.
um, Forster,
Yeah.
but I'm assuming she must have. I know she knew D.H. Lawrence.
Yeah.
Um, but,
Sure, 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 surely she did. Yes, no, the things revolving around a house, and like, and relationships in families as well as relationships between in couples was something that Forster sort of wrote about, and sort of, and also underline the unspoken, because that's a thing that he does that she really, but in fact she
values.
writes about valuing that,
Mm.
doesn't she? She I I I I was reading something to be ready to sort of talk about her, and she wrote an essay about the novel. So I thought I've got to take a look at that. And it's this. She said, the inexplicable presence of the thing not named, of the overtone divined by the ear but not heard by it, the verbal um, mood, the emotional aura of the fact or the thing or the deed. And she says that that's what gives a novel quality, and uh, that's definitely something I think you could see in Forster too. Yeah.
And it's such a modernist idea. I mean, it's fundamentally a modernist
Yeah.
idea.
Yeah. So the fact that she said, I don't, she kind of pretended, she said she didn't like modern things, and, she was on the other side of that divide, doesn't mean that she actually was. It's just,
And we're running out of time, but there's definitely a distinction between what is modern and what is modernist, and she may resist one more than the other potentially. Yeah.
yeah, I think that's probably fair. And she makes Louis, who's one of the professor's son-in-laws, in many ways the most engaging
Yes.
character in the book, and yet he is into things,
Yeah.
and making money and all that,
Materialist. Yeah.
materialist, but he's just the most
Charming and generous. Yes.
warm-hearted, yeah,
Yes.
lovely person in the book. So yeah, what an enjoyable story for all those
Yes.
contradictions.
This has just been lovely. Thank you so much for joining me. And I'm glad you enjoyed the book too. That's
You did me a favor, Hannah, as ever.
thank you. Thank you. Well, thank you again.